and happy to have Alison joining us today. She will be presenting, and thank you everyone who's joining live on YouTube as well, and for everyone who's able to be here presently with us. Alison Gammie is the director of the Division of Training, Workforce Development, and Diversity. Live on YouTube as well, and for everyone who's able. There's also a 10-second delay. So at the National Institute of General Medicine, Medical Sciences, excuse me, NIGMS, she'll be talking today on catalyzing the modernization of the Graduate Biomedical Training Grant, or of Graduate Biomedical Training, excuse me. Alison, go ahead.
Okay, great, thanks. Good morning, everyone. It's great to be here virtually, and I hope all goes well via AP. So I'll move right into the presentation. You calling back? Hello? Is it working okay? Did you call back? Sorry? Okay, are we good to go? Okay, great, all right. So what I'm showing you here are just calls from the community to think about really changing graduate education. And they range from measured responses to really extreme urgency in terms of trying to rethink how we do graduate education. And just to let you know what we're thinking at NIGMS, so what are some of the major training issues that have come to our attention? One thing that if you think about it, if you were a person studying actin back in 1980, you could actually know the entire published literature on actin. But as you can see from a PubMed search in 2017, that would be impossible today, where there's over 100,000 curated articles on actin. Likewise, there's a huge explosion in nucleotide sequences and protein structures when you use the search term actin. So it's really the scientific knowledge base is in a very different place than it was just back in 1980. And we really need to rethink how we train graduate students. Another important issue is one around reproducibility of science. And this has been, again, in the popular press, and a lot of attention has been drawn to the fact that sometimes it's difficult to reproduce major findings, and this can cause issues in terms of a lot of wasted time and effort. And so NIH is taking efforts in this area, but you can imagine that there's a lot you can do in this training space to teach rigor, transparency, with the goal of enhancing reproducibility. Another important issue that I'm sure many of you are aware of from your own campuses is that the way the research incentive structure is set up right now, that it's sometimes in conflict with training goals and training missions, such that students and postdocs often feel as though they're being treated like workforce and not as trainees. And when that happens, you get people asking for more benefits and rights. And so you can just see this is emblematic of some of the conflicts in the research incentive structure with training. Another important issue is to get a sense of the current career landscape. And we have to realize that tenure track research positions, while still available, are just a fraction of where trainees end up in terms of the biomedical research workforce. And so we need to make sure that we're preparing trainees for the range of careers that are out there, and make sure that they have the skills and the knowledge to make informed decisions about the next step. Another important issue that I'm sure you're all aware of is the issue of underrepresentation in the biomedical research workforce. So this slide shows you women are represented with the orange bars, underrepresented women in the light orange bars, men in green, with underrepresented men in light green. And you can see at the associate's level or the bachelor's level, you have strong representation of women and underrepresented minority groups. However, as you start to move up the academic ladder towards being a research scientist, you see a diminishing of underrepresented minorities and women. And when you look to the professor level, you can see an ever more diminishing numbers such that women and underrepresented minorities are significantly missing in the upper levels of academia. What this translates to the NIH workforce, if you look at the census with the colorful bars at the top representing underrepresented minorities, and if you look at the NIH trainees, you can see how the numbers or the percentages compare to the 2010 census. And it's even more striking when you look at NIH principal investigators, where it's almost impossible to even make out certain underrepresented groups compared to well-represented groups. So we have a significant problem with a serious loss of talent over time, and this is something we have to think hard about. So NIGMS, as you may know, is a major funding agency for biomedical education, particularly at the graduate level, where we fund about half of the predoctoral slots across the country. And so we are doing a pilot T32 funding announcement, and the goal of that is to preserve the best elements of graduate education, but we'd really like to catalyze the changes that are needed to keep pace with the rapid evolution of biomedical research. We have a pilot NIGMS specific funding announcement, and the number is here. You're welcome to look it up. And it emphasizes the real goal is to sort of shift towards trainee development and providing the skills needed to transition into careers in the biomedical research workforce. There's also a focus on rigor and transparency, responsible and safe conduct of research, as well as diversity and inclusion throughout the entire training experience, not just the time that the students are on the training grant. We're doing our best to address this conflict in the incentive structure with the research enterprise. We want to ensure that trainees are treated as trainees and not as exclusively as workforce. We're going to require mentor training and oversight of the trainee mentor matches. We're going to require obtainable and measurable training objectives and require the collection and dissemination of data on the successes and failures of these interventions and to post career outcomes on publicly available sites. So the major changes, one is one I've already alluded to, which is the major objective of it. If you look at the parent announcement, you'll see that it was more about having training programs that provided a set of experiences. And we've shifted the emphasis back to the trainee, where we want to see that the training programs develop a diverse pool of ethical, well-trained, rigorous scientists who have the following sets of skills I'm going to go through on these slides. These skills range from the technical to the operational to the professional. And in terms of technical or operational, this would include having a broad understanding across biomedical disciplines and the skills to independently acquire the knowledge needed to advance their chosen field, and the ability to think critically, independently, and to identify important biomedical research questions and approaches that push forward the boundary of their study. Also in the technical and operational, a strong foundation in rigorous research design, experimental methods, quantitative literacy and reasoning skills, and as well as data analysis and interpretation. This also includes experience initiating, conducting, interpreting, and presenting rigorous and reproducible biomedical research with increasing self-direction. And then moving into the professional skills, the ability to work effectively in teams with colleagues from diverse cultural and disciplinary backgrounds, and to promote an inclusive and supportive scientific research environment. The skills and opportunities to communicate scientific research methodology and findings to a wide variety of audiences. This includes discipline-specific, across disciplines, and to the public. And finally, the knowledge and professional skills and experiences required to identify and transition into productive careers in the biomedical research workforce. So we're hoping to see programs that are really aimed at skills development. To drill down to the funding announcement and point out exactly what's different, I've mentioned the differences in the program objective, but there are also some differences in the program plan. We would like to see a rationale, mission, objectives, and then the overall training plan. So as with all training grants or applications, we want to see the rationale for the program and evidence of having successfully trained students in the past. As I mentioned, we now want to see a training mission and objectives, and we want these to be specific and measurable. We would also like to see that the training activities are directed towards building skills that will attain the training objectives. And we want to see plans for using evidence-based approaches in training activities. Some of this, what's similar to what we've asked for before, is explain how differences in backgrounds will be accommodated. We want to see that the enhancements to the training environment go beyond just the supported trainees. And for multidisciplinary programs, how does the training program integrate across the various departments? Finally, it's important to know when you have multiple training grants at a single institution, what are the distinctions as well as the synergies amongst the programs. Something that is new to this funding announcement, but it goes along nicely with the NIH BEST program funded through the Common Fund. We would like to see career preparation be part of the training program. And for starters, it would be, we want to see that training programs post the outcomes so that they have transparency to incoming students and postdocs to what kind of career outcomes they can expect. We also would like to see that trainees are introduced to a range of careers in the biomedical research workforce and, taking a broader view of the careers that support the biomedical research enterprise, and that these are all perfectly acceptable outcomes, but we just want to make sure that trainees are prepared for these careers. And that the training programs are providing opportunities to develop the needed skills for experiential learning, internship, shadowing, and informational interviews. Another part that is potentially new is that we're asking for program oversight across the entire training experience, and to make sure that the trainees are not just looked after for the short time that they're on the training grant, but throughout their time in graduate school. We also want to see that they select faculty into the program based on a commitment to training and mentoring, and that there is mentor training provided to the faculty in the program, that they ensure that the trainees are in research environments that promote the responsible and safe conduct of research, as well as enforcing rigor and transparency to enhance reproducibility. Is everything still okay? Okay. We'd like to see a mechanism for matching the mentors with the mentees and for monitoring the mentor-mentee relationship. We'd also like to see plans for removing faculty that show poor mentorship qualities from the program, not unlike having conflict resolution plans when you have a multi-PI award. Another aspect that's new is we need a strong letter from the institution showing the commitment to the program, that rigor and transparency is reinforced and the responsible conduct of research is valued. We'd like to see that there are startup funds and bridging funds available to ensure training continuity across the graduate experience. We'd like to see that there is staff support and the research infrastructure to support the program. It would be great to see that there's protected time for training and mentoring, that they should consider training and mentoring in tenure and promotion decisions. As I mentioned before, we want to see that the institution provides safe and accessible facilities, that there is a mechanism to support trainees financially throughout their time in graduate school beyond just the training grant period, and that they will support the evaluation of training and mentoring activities, and finally ensure that there's no overlap in the training mechanisms that are coming through the funding agencies. For the principal investigator and the parent announcement, it would talk about wanting to see the expertise in the scientific discipline and ensuring that there is leadership and time commitment. For this pilot, those are important things to think about, but we also want to see that the person has a record of rigorous research, that they have the time commitment, that they have been trained in mentoring, as well as issues around diversity and inclusion. We're actually encouraging a multi-PI model where you can bring in principal investigators with complementary expertise. For example, you might want to bring somebody in the science of education, potentially an institutional leader. If an intervention is going to have a social science or psychosocial component, you might want to bring in expertise across the campus of people who have experience evaluating these types of interventions. For the preceptors or mentors, otherwise known as the faculty, the parent would focus on whether there were sufficient numbers, funding, and the scientific expertise. And while those things are extremely important, we also want to ensure that the faculty have the bandwidth or the time, as well as the commitment to training, and that this is explicitly stated in the bio sketches. We want to ensure that they will provide research opportunities, but beyond that, it is a teaching environment where things like experimental design, rigor and transparency to enhance reproducibility are integral parts of the teaching experience within the laboratory setting. We would also like to see that the preceptors and mentors receive mentor training, and that there's a commitment to diversity and to having a supportive research environment. And again, we'd like to see that the faculty actively promote career development. Even if they don't potentially have the expertise for the range of careers, they're at least supportive of students and trainees finding what they need to find out to transition to the next step. And we really care about diversity at multiple levels, certainly at the student level, but as much as possible at the faculty level. And if there are issues of diversity, what are the plans to enhance diversity of the faculty mentor team? For the trainees, and probably this is something that's really relevant to the group here today, we want the parent announcement was more or less about having sufficient numbers of quote unquote well-qualified students and that there must be an appointment plan. For this pilot, we really want to do what we can to make sure that the trainees are from diverse backgrounds. And this is really broadly defined. This comes from different institution types, geographical locations, racial, ethnic diversity, every type of diversity you can imagine. We really want to also make sure that institutions take chances on students that have the potential to become outstanding scientists. In other words, we'd really like to see a holistic review process when accepting and appointing students. We also, so this is sort of the recruitment plan. We also have an explicit separate retention plan, which is about having oversight of all of the students within the program, given their particular needs during the entire time they're in graduate training. So what I've done is for this particular presentation to pull out some of the specific language in the funding announcement because I think it's relevant to this group today. We want to make sure that the number of requested trainees is well justified, and there should be a description of the resources to support the trainees throughout the duration of their graduate career. We need to see, along these lines, a description of the applicant pool, the applicants that are eligible for training grant support, any new entrants into the program, and the new entrants eligible for support. So this is a specific training table that I'm sure you're familiar with. We would like to see an expansion upon the in the narrative upon the recruitment plan, which is a separate entity, a 3-page document, and we want to have you explain how it will how your program will identify and recruit diverse candidates from, as I mentioned, a variety of institution types, ethnic, racial backgrounds, and with the potential to strongly benefit from and with proper training and support, they will succeed in your program. And so anything that any diversity beyond what can be captured in the standard training tables, we welcome you to describe in the program narrative. As I mentioned, we'd like to see a holistic review process. That means considering metrics beyond just the institution that the student's from, the GPA, or a standardized test score. Want to make sure that you select trainees who are passionate about research and have taken advantage of research opportunities that are available to them, and that they have a strong commitment to contributing to the biomedical research enterprise. And of course, you always need to justify the selection and reappointment criteria for the trainings in the trainee appointment procedures appendix. I mentioned on the previous slide, but just to reiterate again, to expand upon the trainee retention plan, how it will ensure the well-being and success of all of the trainees throughout their graduate training period. Another component of the funding announcement is the training record. This includes, in the parent announcement, it was primarily about completion and time to degree metrics, research accomplishments, including high impact publications, awards, careers in research, and leadership positions. And they also required an evaluation. For the pilot, we think these are important metrics, completion and time to degree, but we'd also like to see that well-represented groups and underrepresented groups have a similar completion time and time to degree. We would also like to see that rigorous research was conducted and that this research advanced scientific knowledge or technologies, but we're not necessarily flagging high impact publications. We think that solid peer-reviewed papers are fantastic, presentations at scientific meetings, anything that indicates that the trainee was self-directed in their research and really pushed forward a project. But it doesn't have to be high impact and leadership positions. We just need evidence that the trainees were engaged in original research. As I mentioned before, there should be plans for tracking the career outcomes of the trainees, and that there need to be recruitment plans for students from underrepresented groups. That part hasn't changed significantly. And we want to see evaluation outcomes and plans to disseminate their findings, and that the programs are responsive to any feedback that comes through the evaluation and the impact outcomes. For the program evaluation, this is an assessment to determine whether the overall program is effective in meeting its specific defined goals and objectives. So they set their own goals and objectives, and then they have to measure these and show in the next funding round that they've met the goals and objectives. We want to see that the scientific research climate is inclusive and supportive of trainee development, that there are plans for being responsive to internal or external outcome analyses, critiques, surveys, and evaluations. There's plans to track trainee and career outcomes and make this data publicly available. All right, so that's it for the presentation. And at this point, I'd be happy to take any questions or if you have any comments. So I guess I'll stop sharing so we can, okay. Okay, hello?
Hi, Alison.
Hey.
This is Matt.
Hey.
Hopefully the people watching live are not giving me two ways.
Okay.
So we have our first question here. It is not necessarily negative that a graduate does not have a publication. Is that correct?
Right. So this is one, actually, this is a complicated issue. I think that publications are a great indication that independent research occurred. And particularly if the trainee is the first author and then the principal investigator is the corresponding author. Let me see if I can mute this or something. Let me mute it so that, okay. Is that better? Feedback. Okay. So it is a tricky business. I think what we want to avoid is to have it be that they have to be, you know, super top tier journals and, you know, I think, so it's not necessarily a negative, but it is worrisome, for example, if students are being, if their work is not being published simply because a principal investigator, you know, as we have heard, will only publish in certain journals. And so if the work isn't significant enough, then the student doesn't get a publication. We think that's very damaging potentially to a student's career. So that's not good for them either. So I think it has to be a balance where you do track it, because it is one of the great metrics that that there was independent research that was conducted. If there are cases where students haven't published, or maybe they're going to publish a year out, which also happens because sometimes, you know, it doesn't get completely finished up or it's still in the review process, that just needs to be explained, I think, in the narrative. And so I think the whole point is that this is about what's best for the trainees. And if you can explain that your record really is in alignment with what's best for the trainees, then I think that's the thing to do. But So it's not that you want to veer away from counting publications, but you want to not necessarily only reward those that are in what are considered to be high impact journals.
Great. And as a follow-up question to that, do meeting presentations have equal weight?
You know, I think it depends on the field. And so I know that at least colleagues of mine in computer science, giving a talk at a meeting is huge. So I think that you, again, need to explain potentially to the reviewers what the significance, you know, if that really is in some cases the equivalent of the highest honorific, then that needs to be explained to other folks where really publications tend to be, you know, a higher metric for scientific recognition in the community. So I can't say, you know, a lot of it is how you explain things to the reviewers, and then you help them to understand the data that you're providing.
Thank you. Is there a preference on when funding starts? Year one, when a student turns into a candidate?
Yeah, so NIGMS tends to like to fund early. So we're the basic science division, and we acknowledge that we're sort of doing the heavy lift for training when students are taking courses and doing rotations, and they have other activities. And then they transition into the research lab where they're doing more specific research that could be funded by the principal investigator, or if the student gets an independent fellowship, or in some cases they go to a second training grant and it's in a more specialized discipline. So we tend to like to have the funding of the students be in the first few years, with the understanding that sometimes institutions will pay for the first year, so it can be offset in the second and third year. It's really kind of, we understand that there are some institutional restrictions, but we like to see funding early.
Then as another question, is there funding to develop career programs or rigor and reproducibility training?
Oh yeah, wow, I'm so sorry. I left this off this slide deck. Yes, so right now there is a funding announcement on the street for what's called an R25 mechanism. This is to develop training modules to enhance rigor and transparency. We have already funded some in the past, and you can go to our webpage and find these modules online. But we would welcome you, if you're interested in developing one at your institution, to apply for this R25. And then we intend to, with some of the, just now that we just got the budget, with some of the funds that have come in, is to reissue supplements for our predoctoral T32 awards. We've done this in the past in 3 areas: rigor and transparency, career preparedness, and then for skills development. We're going to add a 4th category this time in having safe research environments, and so in the area of sort of safety. And so be on the lookout for those. We're hoping to get those out soon. They're about 80,000. They typically go towards salary support and other things that help to develop the curriculum or the training activities. The only caveat is that we ask that you come to our biannual meeting and produce and report back on what you implemented, so that other training programs can hear about your successes and, you know, potentially failures, but at least trying new things. So yes, we do have funds to try to help catalyze some of these changes. The other thing to look to for career preparedness is the BEST program. There are, I think, 17 institutions across the country that got these BEST awards. And if you go online, they've developed a lot of material, and they've come up with ideas, and I would potentially contact those PIs as well.
So we have our first question from one of our online viewers. What sort of examples might you see as evidence that programs themselves and not the overall school are conducting adequate recruitment?
What counts as evidence? So we have some, is this recruitment for underrepresented minorities or just recruitment in general?
I would assume.
Oh, sorry, I lost you.
Sorry.
Okay.
Underrepresented.
Okay, yeah, so we do have, if you go to our webpage, there is some sort of suggestions and advice for what programs can do that go above and beyond just what the institution does in terms of recruitment. Obviously, it needs to be tailored to your type of program and the type of students. I think we all know about the standard meetings for of SACNAS and ABRCAMS, where if you send faculty out, particularly if they engage with trainees in terms of being poster judges and other such things, I think that you can form a really nice connection. It's a great way to meet trainees and have scientific conversations with them. There's a whole range of different things, and it's sort of institution specific, but activities would be anything that goes beyond what the standard institution does. And probably the example that I can move to that is more clear cut is in the area of disabilities. So most institutions, well, I would say all institutions have to comply with providing accommodations, but just providing accommodations isn't really enough. You need to do something to get out there into the community and to try to reach out to those with disabilities specifically beyond just providing accommodations, which is sort of just standard procedures because of that's the law. So we do, if you go to the webpage, there are at least some suggestions there. Not that you have to do those things, but if it helps you get some ideas, and then you can tailor it to your particular institution. So I hope that was answering your question. Was it how do we monitor it, or was it how to do it?
We'll have an
Okay.
Well, one of the things to mention is that in terms of recruitment and being visible at conferences and stuff like that, and this is a reminder for all of us as well, BioGAP does its lesser at both ABRCAMS as well as the SACNAS annual conferences. So if you have participated, survey went on about that, absolutely. Yes, you answered the question perfectly.
Okay, thanks, okay.
Then, my next question, do you have data showing the effectiveness or ineffectiveness of GREs as an indicator of student effectiveness that we can use to convince faculty of what's that they do?
I think if I heard, I'm going to say the question back because I had a little bit of trouble hearing, but are there data available showing that the GRE is not particularly effective at predicting success in graduate school? Was that right? Okay. Yes. So there are studies, and in particular, and they're across the spectrum of showing basically that at best the standardized tests can predict how well a student may do in their first year classes, but they're not predictive beyond that. And so I think that most faculty will ultimately agree that it's not how a student does in classes, but really how they perform in the research laboratory and in the research setting that is the real key to graduate success and ultimate success in the biomedical research workforce. So yes, there are also data that show that in fact, if you use the GRE, then you're actually disadvantaging women and underrepresented minorities because they tend to underperform, and there's a lot of also literature about that in terms of stereotype threat and other issues in terms of how people underperform in certain standardized tests when there's an expectation that they'll underperform. And so I think that it's even, it's a combination of not being particularly predictive as well as potentially being discriminatory. So I think that it is important to have those conversations. Probably the best thing you can do is to find, an advocate, somebody who's read these papers, who goes in and makes the case that it's not particularly predictive. So yeah, there is sort of mounting evidence out there in this space that is in particular is not a good metric for success in the biomedical workforce.
So while there is a ton of research as a bit of a follow-up, how do the decisions trickle down to the schools for removing the GREs? Is there anything the NIH can do to help get this message out?
I mean, I think that what we've done, we've already removed it from the training table, so that's a start. And the fact that it's not there for reviewers to look at, and it's not being requested anymore. That's one step. And then we explicitly stated in the funding announcement, and I probably went through it too quickly, but that we are really encouraging a more holistic review process where there should not be based strictly on metrics, standard metrics, and then we included the GRE in there as well. Obviously, you know, we can't, there's not much we can do to, you know, we can't stop people from doing it, and I've certainly had angry people who really believe in it and are angry that, you know, we're trying to tell them what to do, and it's like, well, you know, we can't actually force you not to, but just know the literature and try the experiment. Try it 1 year and see if you know, try to convince yourself. If you don't believe the literature, you know, take a chance. Invite some students who don't necessarily perform well on the GRE, but they have performed well in terms of research experience and people advocating for them in terms of letters of recommendation and they write a really passionate personal statement that shows that they love research and they're dedicated, and you know, take a chance on that person and those people and convince yourself. So it's a tough one because we can't necessarily enforce it. The most we can do is not ask for it and then put some language in the funding announcement, and the rest I think is going to be, you know, a culture change that's going to take a little bit of time.
Thank you. Can you expand on what your expectations at NIH-NIGMS are for institutional commitment?
Yeah, so I think that it was that if we go back to one of the slides, we did lay it out pretty well. I don't know. Again, I probably went through it pretty fast, but some of the things, I can go back through here because you don't. I'm not sharing my screen anymore, but yeah, we want to make sure some of the things that they really encourage rigor and transparency as well as responsible conduct of research, and that is more important than, you know, necessarily some of the issues around the research incentive structure, which is bringing in more grants and more papers and others. So we would really like to see a commitment to, you know, rigorous science, that's valued. Bridging funds and startup funds, providing staff support, research infrastructure, giving protected time for training and mentoring to acknowledge that it is actually teaching when it's done well, so that should be acknowledged. Considering training and mentoring and tenure and promotion, providing safe and accessible facilities, having financial support for trainees across their whole pathway and ensuring that there are not going to be gaps or discontinuities in their funding, and that they'll support the evaluation of the training and mentoring activities. And finally, that they you know, ensure that there's no overlap across training mechanisms. So these are some of the things we'd like to see in terms of institutional commitment.
Okay. Going back to the question about the GRE for a minute, if we do take chances with these and they do not turn out well and become a higher rate of attrition, will we then be cited or punished essentially by the NIH when we apply for future grants?
So I think what you should do, you know, again, we're saying you can set up your own, you have your own training goals and objectives. And if you, and taking a more evidence-based approach to training activities. So if you really want to, you know, try the experiment, you want to say, okay, I know people are nervous about it because they've always relied on GREs and other metrics. But if you say, we're going to do this because we really want to reach a certain student population that we're missing within our institution, and you know, acknowledging that there could be some biases in the system, we want to take a chance. And we want to, so it's an experiment. It's going to have an outcome, and you report that. And I think that that's what the reviewers are going to have to look at. And training outcomes can be that whatever you learn is a positive thing. So it's not a negative outcome that you took a chance and that there could be some variability. You know, that's an outcome and you've learned from it. And so that's a positive thing.
Thank you, Dr.
Alison, we have another question here. Are we expecting to see any similar changes with the MSTP grant?
Yes, so the MSTP is going to be offset by a year, but we have been given the go-ahead for it to have its independent funding announcement, which it hasn't had. So all of these programs were kind of lumped together under a parent. And so because it was trying to be kind of everything for everybody, it wasn't very specific. And so we're hoping now to have it be, again, more specific for the medical science training program as well. I mean, there are some similarities between this, obviously, but there will be some differences because of the nature of the training program, the length of the training program. There are a lot of considerations that are potentially different, but there are clearly some areas for common themes. And that's due to come out, if we hope, in September.
Also, I can talk up, but the question was, does institutional bias exist and how do you combat that?
But you mean bias in terms of people tend to like to get trainees from certain institutions?
Yes.
Yeah, I would say. I would guess, I mean, you know, I'm going out on a limb here. You guys know better, you're in the field more, but I've certainly, in my experience before I came to NIH, have noticed that there have been institutional biases. But again, that can change with experience. And so if you only bring in students from a certain institution type, you don't really have a comparator. Once you start bringing in the comparators, sometimes you see that the students perform equally well, if not better. So I think, again, it takes a culture change. But I would say there are, I mean, you know best. You're kind of in the trenches on some level, but I've certainly seen it myself. Sorry, I missed that.
On the NIH-NIGMS side during the review process, is there any institutional bias that might exist or combating that?
The NIH-NIGMS review process? Is that what you said?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, okay. Sorry, I think I got that. I think, you know, anytime you have human beings involved in an endeavor, you know, there's a potential for bias, and I think that we have to acknowledge that and not pretend like it doesn't exist. And so the hope is that if you have more explicit review criteria, which we do now, we can actually try to combat some unintentional biases towards certain institutions, or, you know, we're trying to shift the emphasis away from it being exclusively about research productivity, research activity as being what constitutes a good training program. That is, of course, important, but that's a necessary condition, but it's not sufficient. You have to have all of these other aspects to have excellence in training. And so that means that as long as you have you know, robust research and you have these other training elements, then that's what constitutes a good program. And now we have it very explicitly stated in the review criteria. So if somebody is veering towards, you know, biases, then it can be kind of brought back into a place where we're trying to be inclusive of all institution types. And I think that you know, we certainly at NIH-NIGMS are committed to reaching the you know, philosophy really is that great science is happening all over the place, and you can't really predict where the next great scientific breakthrough is going to come from. And so you should have a range of people well funded across the country. And I think we feel the same with training. So, you know, I don't want to say there's not, of course, you know, humans are biased. We are all biased. You know, and we have to guard against it and be constantly vigilant. And I think it's important to acknowledge it and do everything we can to have safeguards in the system.
Great. Are there any plans to, or goals to redistribute funding, letting new programs get slots and reduce old programs?
We don't have a specific agenda. I think that one thing that is true is that all of the grants coming in are new, meaning that you don't, you know, you can talk about previous training record, but there isn't a a sense that if you had, 25 slots in the past, that doesn't really apply anymore. So you just have to justify why you need those 25 slots, and that it really is in line with other programs and what percentage of their population, training eligible students that they're supporting. So if some slots free up, obviously that opens up the system. However, I should say there's a pretty good, in the pre-doctoral T32, there is a pretty good turnover where new programs are coming in, and we certainly encourage that, because it brings about culture changes. Any new place that you have a training program, it really can, as we say, catalyze some change, and so that's a great thing. But we don't have a specific agenda. It could potentially work out that way, because slots have to be well justified. New programs people may be more encouraged to apply that weren't before because they didn't think they would be competitive. And now that they read the funding announcement, they say, oh, wait, we have great training. We could potentially be competitive. So we might bring in some places that were kind of opting out. So it'll be interesting to see what happens, but there's not an agenda. We'll see how it goes.
Do we have any final questions? Thank you very much for joining and being with us and answering all of our questions.
Oh, sure. And feel free, you know where we are. Feel free to contact any of us if you have, program directors or myself, Shiva Singh. If you have more questions, we're happy to answer them.
Thanks so much. Have a great day.
Okay, you too. Take care. Bye.